Good afternoon. Or if you're watching the recording, good evening, good morning, I don't know. You guys are all over the place. Thank you for watching this live session of Let's Talk About Hegel. Let's Talk About Hegel live, therefore. Going to talk about different topics having to do with the philosophy of Hegel. And I'm going to answer questions if there are any, if there are people who want to chat with me, you can do that. You can take a look at the comment section and ask your question. And we're going to try and answer those questions. Okay. Let's go back to a very basic idea, and that is the question, what is philosophy? What is philosophy? And Hegel gives an answer to that question in the introduction to his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. It's a very interesting answer, actually. It makes a couple of things clearer. Let me talk to you about this first paragraph of the introduction to the Encyclopedia. Hegel says philosophy doesn't have two advantages that other sciences have. The first advantage is that philosophy is unable to simply collect its objects, the things it talks about, from normal experience, what he calls Vorstellung. We have all kinds of mental images of reality. We have all kinds of objects that we can talk about. We can talk about visible things, trees, animals. We can talk about less visible things like the institutions of our society. We can talk about electricity and the cosmos and all of those issues. Well, we take them from experience, from the Vorstellung, the mental image of those things. So we can have cosmology and sociology and politicology, political sciences, I think it's called. We can have that because those sciences start with their objects being given to experiences some way. And then Hegel says, philosophy can't do that. It cannot presuppose a whole lot of objects that it wants to talk about and think about from experience, just like that. Because philosophy doesn't speak about the way things are, it doesn't talk about what is going on in the world. Philosophy doesn't deal with electricity as a force and the method that you have to use that force. It doesn't do that. Objects of philosophy are not what it says here in the German text, unmittelbar von der Vorstellung zugegeben. They are not simply presented by these mental images that we have on the basis of our experience. A second disadvantage of philosophy, when you study biology, you learn about the methods of the science of biology. How do you reach some kind of conclusion? How can you build a theory? Well, there is a specific biological method that is already there. When you study biology, that is the method that you can presuppose. Without applying that method, you can't do biological research. Well, that kind of presupposition doesn't work in philosophy. You start with doing philosophy, there is no method already available that you can simply adopt from previous generations, and that's it. So, in German, die Methode des Erkennens, the method of knowing, you cannot voraussetzen, you cannot presuppose that als bereits angenommen, something that everyone agrees upon. When you're doing biology, the biological object and the biological method are already given and shared by all biologists. Now, there might be one thing that you can say about the object of philosophy, and that is that it seems to be about the same things that religion talks about. Religion, after all, talks about the highest possible truth and the highest possible goodness, and maybe also the highest possible beauty, to speak in the manner of Plato, and the highest truth, the highest being, the highest goodness, the highest beauty. It's one and the same thing. It's like the absolute, the thing that we strive to understand in philosophy, that we strive to understand and experience as well in religion. So, religion and philosophy seem to share at least this little object, well, little, this universal absolute object, and that is truth. And truth in the highest way possible, not just the truth of 2 plus 2 equals 4, not just the truth of how the biology of living animals work, etc. In religion, God is the absolute and highest truth. In philosophy, the absolute is the highest truth. There seems to be a similarity between the two. And of course, theology also talks about finite things like nature and human spirit, and so does philosophy. Now comes the point. That doesn't mean, all of this doesn't mean that we don't have a method, that we don't have an object, that we have some similarity with religion and philosophy, and that's it. Now, how do you build a philosophy then? You cannot use revelation in philosophy. You cannot use scripture in philosophy. The starting point of all philosophy is the human mind, is human thinking. Then Hegel states that, of course, we have some kind of superficial knowledge of all the topics that we will talk about. Eine Bekanntschaft, we know about them because we do have this experience, we do have these Vorstellungen of nature and human spirit, some ideas, they're all around us. We have categories and concepts like the state or property. We have categories within the philosophy of nature, like what is a living thing? What is the exact difference between living and non-living entities? We have a certain Bekanntschaft. We know a little about them. And we have to deal with that kind of Bekanntschaft or superficial knowledge, because that's the way this human endeavor of philosophy actually works. We have this whole mass of things that we have some acquaintance with. Bekanntschaft actually means acquaintance, to know of something in a superficial way. And now we have to try not just to know about them, to be acquainted with them, to act pragmatically with them, but we have to try and really understand them. There's a huge difference between knowing about something in a very general way, to have some kind of experience with things, and scientific knowledge, Wissenschaft, really knowing something, but that also differs from a third way of looking at the world, and that is to understand them, to understand our experience, to understand the world philosophically, which is understanding in the form of concepts, conceptual knowledge. But that's how it starts. We start with these mental images of things and our experience and the scientific exploration of the objects. That's what we start with. Vorstellungen von Gegenstände, mental images of objects. But then we have to try and bring about a conceptual understanding of all those things. Hegel says here, the thinking mind can only, through representations, Vorstellungen, experiences, finally figure out what absolute truth and reality is. So we have a kind of knowledge that is all about thought and thinking, a kind of knowledge that expresses itself not in merely statement of facts, even not in stating universal laws of the behavior of things, like in natural sciences, but um, the thinking mind tries to find the conceptual. Well, let me use a word that I want you to forget, actually, because it's not very good to use, the conceptual essence of something. That is what we need to do. Now, we have to make sure that we also understand that when our thinking has not yet reached this level of conceptual understanding, of begrijpen, then actually what we just have are opinions, statements with some kind of deepity, some kind of depth, seeming to be very wise and touching the essence of things, but they are of no use whatsoever. Because philosophy has to meet two different demands. First of all, it has to prove, to demonstrate the necessity of each of her statements. Every philosophical proposition expressing the conceptual content, the conceptual truth of something, has to be seen to be and demonstrated to be necessary, in the sense that there's no other way to say it, in the sense that only by saying it like this, we encapsulate, we capture the real being, the real essence of a thing. And secondly, philosophy, certainly after Descartes, is not allowed to have a set of opinions or a set of presuppositions as a starting point. Philosophy has to be developing its object from a certain start and has to go to a whole procedure or process in which it demonstrates every next step as a necessary next step. There is a dynamic going on. There is a system being built. There is a road that we travel. It's not just that we have a certain position with which we look, from which we look at life and everything, and from there on we can simply pinpoint the things that there are. We can simply make propositions about it. Now we are going through a process. And certainly in something like a book like The Phenomenology of the Mind, of the Spirit, Hegel is actually showing that and demonstrating that. And that leads to a final point, because if it's a road, if philosophy is more like a procedure or process, then the question is, where do we start from? Where do we start from? Well, we need to start with a position, because we need a position anyway. We cannot start without any kind of position. But that position must, first of all, have the least possible presuppositions. And secondly, it must be a position that we, in the further process of our philosophical thinking, demonstrate to be the necessary starting point. In the logic, in philosophy of nature, in the philosophy of spirit, we always have this search for the primary position, which has the least presuppositions. And then part of the whole process is to demonstrate that that position, that starting point, is actually necessary. So the problem of the beginning of philosophy, Hegel talks extensively about that in the introduction, the preface, and the introduction to the Science of Logic, but he also talks about it right here in the introduction to the Encyclopedia. Well, let's summarize for a moment. What do we have here? Philosophy cannot presuppose an understanding of its objects. It can't allow presuppositions, certainly not with regard to its method. It has to deal with the same object that religion deals with. That is to say, the absolute and the finite, the relationship, the truth in the highest sense of the word. We have to make use, however, of everything that we are acquainted with and try to understand that conceptually in order to reach the truth. And for that to happen, we have to demonstrate the necessity of every step we take. And we have to leave behind all our assurances and presuppositions to make a beginning which has the least of the presuppositions. And we have to demonstrate that only that single presupposition, this beginning of everything, beginning of the logic, beginning of the encyclopedia, etc., that is necessary. That is quite a high demand for a philosophical system, but it's easy to see that there is no way to get around it. We cannot simply argue that what theology says about the absolute must be the truth, because theology relies on the idea of revelation, which is also an historical idea. We cannot start with a given method because there is none. The method itself is a topic, an object of philosophy, and we have to demonstrate the necessity of our method as well as the content of that method, the various structures that are part of the method. Okay, so that is the first paragraph of the encyclopedia. Let's see what is the relationship between concepts, thoughts, and these representations, Vorstellungen, these mental pictures, mental images that we have of the world. That's the topic of the second paragraph in this introduction to the encyclopedia. Hegel starts with this nice statement. Philosophy, at first, in general, can be considered to be a thinking understanding or a thinking approach to its objects. Thinking, not, let's say, representations are important, no feelings, no intuitions, nothing but the concept. Human beings differ from animals, he argues, because they are thinking animals. They use language, they use thought. But philosophy is not thinking in general. It's a very specific way of thinking. Therefore, the activity of thinking within a human being that has many different forms or structures. Okay, human thought is always human thought. But we have many forms of understanding and awareness that is thinking, it is thought, but it's in a different form. Let's say my feeling, my basic feeling about myself is thinking. It is certainly not thinking in a conceptual manner. The whole of the acquaintance I have with the world, for the most part practical and pragmatic, is a form of thinking. However, it's not thinking exactly in the conceptual form of thinking. Human thought has many different ways of being there. One of the ways I talked about with Ivana last time, we talked about the concept of Andacht. Andacht is an interesting German word. It means piety. It means worship. Andacht. Andacht comes from andenken. It's not thinking, it's not thought, but thinking of something, or thinking towards something, or thinking connected with something. The real conceptual way of thinking takes its object as object. We think something. But we have prepositions that can help us explain that there is a way of thinking that is not so straightforward, um, going after its object. Something like, therefore, Andacht, but also our sentiments, our feelings, our intuitions, various ways of being in the world can be thought of as thinking, but is not one single way of thinking. So we have lots of ways of thinking that do not have really the structure of thought in the sense of conceptual thought. Now, it's important to stress this point because this is where Hegel differs also from many contemporary philosophers. There's a whole school of thought that says that actually emotions and sentiments and feelings are a way better approach to reality than maybe rational thought. So that's the distinction that is being made. You have on the one hand very formal, rational thought, and you have on the other hand inner sensations, feelings, intuitions. And the latter would give us a better understanding of reality. You can imagine why people would think that. Isn't it true to say that every thought is accompanied by feelings? That feelings might be the first step in trying to understand something, and then afterwards, reflective thought comes in to help us explain what we have just felt. Let's say you're walking on the street and there is a van coming at you with high speed. Well, first of all, you would have this feeling of danger. There's danger coming. And secondly, you would try to think about what is this van doing there? Why is it driving so fast, etc.? It seems to be that in our everyday contact with the world, feelings and sentiments are way more important than conceptual thinking. And the concept is latter. Hi, Sevan. Nice to see you here. And thank you for your remark. So, is feeling more important? Or let's take a look at the other thing that is quoted a lot is intuition. Isn't it true that whenever we have conceptual understanding of something, there is also an intuitive element involved? You might say, well, the intuition of the artist, for instance, when he's making a painting, is way more important than the conceptual understanding afterwards of what it actually is that he has painted or what he actually tried to say. The first thing is the impression of colors and shapes and the combination of these colors that gives you a certain feeling as an onlooker. And certainly we can presuppose that the artist has all kinds of sentiments, feelings, intuitions, where he's intuited what is the right color here, what is the right shape over there. And only afterwards, in reflection, in hindsight, would he be able to say, well, there is a reason that I have drawn a red triangle right in this corner. Because somehow the equilibrium of the whole representation is involved. So in many instances, it seems that there is a kind of order, a sequence in time, that intuition and feelings come first. And that conceptual truth is something that happens in hindsight, in reflecting after the intuition and the emotion to try and figure out what it meant and what it by what it is triggered. Now, if you take the Hegelian approach, you say, well, look, the intuition is not something other than thought. It's a different form of thought. And what people think nowadays is that there is a sort of separation between the two. That rational thought cannot deal with the fullness of the truth that is given in intuition. And also you can, in this case, imagine why that would work. And intuition is an overwhelming inner experience. It gives you the illusion that you totally understand something. You're totally knowledgeable about what you see. And now you try to express that in language. And it seems that the language you have to use, the concepts you have to use, they are so abstract, so devoid of sentiment, power, persuasiveness. Um, they're like the stenography after a very heated argument. It's merely the words that have been used, but it does not convey the full experience of the intuition. On the basis of that, so first of all, the temporal sequence and now the intensity of the experience, you might say that conceptual thinking is secondary. The expression in words is secondary. The word is less important than the image. Why? Because the image evokes intuitions, sentiments, feelings, and the word doesn't do that. Only if the word then refers to something that you can imagine in your mind can the words have a similar effect. That's how people think about literature sometimes. Literature has to evoke emotions. If it doesn't evoke emotions, it's like doing arithmetic. Now, Hegel disagrees with this. And that's interesting because it's like a general presupposition that we have a bias toward the intuitive because it's so strong, toward feelings and sentiments because they precede conceptual thinking. We have a bias toward the both because we think that's the real encounter with reality, and concepts are a secondary way to express all of that. Now, Hegel says, whenever we talk about intuition, the interesting thing is, what is the intuition actually intuiting? What is it seeing? You can have intuitions, and then you don't have an object. You don't have a statement about the truth. You don't have anything that is clear in it. It's a pure form of an intuition. I don't know what it looks like. Because whenever you have an intuition, you also already have some idea, some thought about the content of that intuition. So, can we really divide the two, separate the two? Well, an intuition without thinking can be a grand experience, can be very forceful, but it's blind. It doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't give us something to remember. It doesn't give us anything to refer to later. It's only when it is expressed conceptually that we have a content, that we have something to talk about, that we have a proposition that tells us something about the truth. Well, if that's the case, as soon as we have expressed the content of the intuition properly, then the intuition itself, as this one moment in time, this one experience, doesn't play a role anymore. The concept takes over because even in our intuitions, we are interested in the contents of it. And after having expressed the content in concepts, the experience of the intuition doesn't count for very much. It doesn't matter if you have an intuition that 2 times 2 equals 5, and you have this enormous intensity of that intuition, and you have this inner certainty and inner awareness that that is actually the truth of the whole matter, 2 times 2 equals 5, and then you write it down, you consider it, and you compare it to other statements, and you find out in this rational procedure that it is totally nonsense because the meaning of 2 and 5 are distorted. They're no longer a meaning that you can really maintain. Intuition can be fantastic. It's like waking up in the middle of the night with a ingenious idea. It's brilliant, you know that. Intuition is so strong that you believe it fully. So you go to sleep again, and the next morning you wake up and you look at your notebook, you've written down your great intuition, and it's worth nothing. Absolutely nothing. That leads Hegel in another context to say that the truth of any proposition or rather the truth of anything, is revealed in the proposition that defines it thinkingly, that defines it in the form of the concept. Because truth needs to be expressed, and to be expressed means to be conceptualized, and to be conceptualized means to be written down. There's a linguistic element to that. It has to be written down. Does this separation, says Tom, hi Tom, nice of you to be here. Does this separation between concept, intuition, and object describe what Hegel calls the Sollen? I don't think so. Sollen is the German word for ought to, for moral necessity. So I don't think that we have this here. There is this idea that, let's say, whatever we have in intuition, whatever we have in feelings and sentiments and representations and perceptions, that ultimately can only be true if it is expressed. That's a necessity. And you might use the word Sollen in German in that context. But I don't think he even uses it like that. Sollen is really this moral necessity or moral law. But substance has to become subject. That is a nice phrase that Hegel uses in the preface to the Phenomenology to say everything that we think about in terms of pure object, substance, needs to be expressed in unity with the thought that thinks it. I will say that again. So everything that we simply accept as objectively present needs to be expressed, including the subjectivity, including our own understanding of it, as the whole thing. We cannot ever have a distinction or a separation between the object of thinking and thinking itself. Thank you, Tom, for your remark. I hope you keep listening or listen to it afterwards. So, knowledge is either finalized in concepts and language, or it even is only expressed in concepts and language, or it even just starts with concepts and not with experience whatsoever. And there is a whole line, what we call empiricism. Empiricism says all knowledge starts with experience and cannot go beyond experience. Experience defines everything, which gives us great problems with categories that we like to use, even in sciences, like causality. Causality cannot be simply based on experience. Causality is a category, a way of thinking. Then you have this interesting question in the philosophy of Kant. When we see a ball hitting another ball on the billiard table, snooker table, and the second ball moves away from the first, what are we actually seeing here? Well, we're seeing something in a sequence of time, sequence of moments. Ball A moving toward ball B, touching it, ball B moving away. That's two events. The event of ball A going to ball B and the event of the movement of ball B. That's a sequence in time. Now, we are pretty sure that the reason that ball B started moving is because it was touched by ball A. It hit ball B, and therefore ball B started going in motion. We know about kinetic energy, we know about laws of motion, etc. But did we see that? Did we see that ball A, the movement of ball A, was the cause of the movement of ball B? Well, we didn't. And David Hume says, therefore, the causality, the idea that ball A caused ball B to move, is merely an assumption. Technically, it's an assumption. It's a very good assumption. It's something that you will really see happening all the time. So it's a very good idea to have, but it's still, technically speaking, an assumption. You can never be really sure, because there is no actual necessity in it. Why not? Why can't I say it's necessary for ball B to move after being touched by ball A? Well, because I can't see it. There's no basis for it in experience. And according to the empiricist position, if there is no basis for it in experience, you cannot maintain it. It can't be a necessary and universal truth. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to start thinking. And we need to start thinking without this separation, this artificial separation between conceptual thinking, rational thinking, reasoning on the one hand, and then sentiments, intuitions, feelings on the other hand. Sentiments and feelings and intuitions are already forms of thought. And I think that maybe Hegel here is referring back also to a guy like Baruch de Spinoza, who lived a century before Hegel. Spinoza arguing in his Ethica, his major work, that an emotion that is understood stops being an emotion and becomes a thought. It's somehow similar, I think, to what Hegel is saying here. If we have really thought, that is to say, to have brought something into the structure of a proposition or the structure of a concept, then the feeling is no longer of importance. It's merely an accompanying element of our experience. But it doesn't matter. I can be enthusiastic about 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 3 equals 6. With my enthusiasm, or lack of enthusiasm, because I'm bored with it, doesn't add anything to the truth of it. The truth is a matter of the proper application of arithmetic, of mathematical categories, mathematical ideas. Finally, in this session, there is a sentence in the philosophy of right, so the separate, large philosophy of right, that is very interesting for our purposes. And that is this statement: what is reasonable is real, and what is real, that is reasonable. Maybe that is the most difficult sentence Hegel ever wrote. Not because it's complex, not complicated at all, but because the consequences of that statement are maybe very difficult to understand. Let's take the first line. What is reasonable is real. Whatever you can think of, really think of, must have a reality in the world. Now let's consider this. The terrible snowman. I can think of him, can't I? So therefore he must be real? No, that's not the point. The terrible snowman is not a thought. Terrible snowman is the name for a representation, or is a representation of something that might be real, but surely also doesn't have to be real. There's no necessity involved. So I can't say everything that I can think of has to be real. The only one is reasonable. Now, reasonable in terms of things within our experience is that I have some empirical proof for that. Hegel knows that as well. But what is truly reasonable, what has this inner rationality, this necessity, like the idea of liberty. Liberty is a necessary idea. If you consider human nature, if you consider the way humans interact with each other, liberty is a necessary concept. So it has to be real. It has to be there to some extent. Cannot be that we are mistaken and that liberty actually doesn't exist or is in no way valid. That's what he means here. What is truly reasonable, of course it has to be real. Because on the other hand, everything that we find in our experience that is real is real on account of the fact that we can truly think it and truly understand it. Otherwise, it really cannot exist, cannot be real. So not in the realm of empirical objects like the terrible snowman, but in the realm of, let's say, social institutions. The state must be real because it's reasonable. And whatever is real about the state must be reasonable. It goes both ways. So the state can do things that are unreal, that don't really have anything solid in reality connected to it. But that's because it's not reasonable. But whatever the state does that is reasonable will also be real. In the context of philosophy of right, that's the way it works. There is a reality and reason are commensurate. They belong together. Ultimately, they're one and the same in Hegel's way of thinking. So, when we talk about reality, when we talk about philosophy, if it's totally sensible, reasonable, using all these characteristics that I talked about, that came from the first paragraph of this introduction, if it's about the absolute, if it includes our subjectivity, substance must be expressed as subject, Hegel says. If it includes our subjectivity, it's not just an abstract idea of a reality outside of myself. If it is involved in a path, in a progress from something that has the least possible presuppositions unto the fullness of the explication, the explanation of reality. If philosophy can be done like that, it can truly give us an understanding of the totality of reality. Every hint and nuance of that reality will be considered conceptually and expressed conceptually. Okay, I know that some of the things I've just been talking about might not be immediately clear. If you want to, I can always come back to these issues in our next session, which will be next week, also at 2:00. If there is any question that you would like to ask, this is the moment for it. This is the moment. I know you're not with many, but some of you are here. Some of you might have also left. But if there's someone here listening to this broadcast, and if you have a question, you can ask it now in the chat stream. And if not, I will say goodbye, and I will return next week to try again. Remember, this is still an experiment. We're still doing an experiment. So if there's any question, let me know it now. Let's take a little break, and then we'll return to... Oh, Tom has already a question. So, if something appears in the world, it must have an element of rationality to it. Yeah, the short answer is yes. Nothing can be real without being also rational, reasonable. Now, of course, there's one way of looking at it, saying, well, if something appears in the world and it would not be rational, it would not have anything to do with reasonability, how would you know about it? How would you be able to express it? How would you be able to communicate it? And let's say, Tom, on your end, in the room that you're sitting in, something appears. And you want to tell me about it, but it has no rationality, it has no reasonability. How would you do that? Hegel would say, well, you can only point at it, but if I can't see the same, or when I'm looking at it the next day, it wouldn't be there. And if something appears that you can only point at, now, what can you say about it then? There's nothing to say about it. And therefore, is it really true that something appeared in the world? Even that requires language and a concept. So indeed, every reality must have a conceptual reality to it, a conceptual expressions for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be possible to communicate it or talk about it. Now, let's suppose you have an intuition of something, and in your own private mythological language, you call it an angel. That's great. I understand what you mean because I know what the reference means, because I know literature in which angels are described and defined. But I couldn't be sure that it really appears in the world, would it? There's no reasonability in the idea that angels exist and that you can tangibly ascertain that they are here. And you can't touch them, you can't see them. So indeed, if something appears in the world, it must have an element of rationality to it. Now, there's one way to look at it. Well, let's leave it at that for the moment. Any other questions for those of you who are still here? No? This Friday, we'll have a second recording for you of the conversation between Ivana and myself. We will still be talking about unhappy consciousness and the relationship with religion. The first installment was published, I think, yesterday with the title, Let's Talk About Hegel. And don't need to remind you on what channel you can find it. It's this channel that you're on right now. And so take a look at it. Maybe you have questions about it. You can put them in the comments below the YouTube video. And if I can find the time, I will try to answer your questions, your comments, your responses in our next session. So thank you very much for being here. Hope to see you again next week. So thank you. Bye-bye.